Hello, my name is Michael Weisletter. I am a first-year MBA student at MIT Sloan, and it is my distinct pleasure to introduce you to Cynthia DuBois, who will be presenting her CA on the efficacy of the Rooney Rule.
Thank you so much, and thank you guys for being here this afternoon. When I walked into the room at the end of the last one, they were talking about strategic napping. So thank you guys for pushing through. I think a lot of us could probably use a strategic nap at this point of the day. My name's CC DuBois. I'm from Northwestern University, and we're going to be talking a little bit today about the efficacy of the Rooney Rule. Now, there's a long history of studying the causal impacts of affirmative action and desegregation in the United States. However, most of that is really focused on the federal government's criteria that are used in the federal contractor program, which really focus on sort of rank and file workers. And one of the things that we started to notice very quickly is that the spillover effect, the positive spillover effect that these programs have had, really wasn't spilling over to the corporate boardroom. At executive levels of leadership, we were starting to see, just really a disequilibrium in regards to diversity in the boardroom. As this article says, not even 1% of Fortune 500 companies will have black CEOs. Another area that was starting to look at diversity was emerging technology sectors. And one of the things we started to notice as well is that a couple of these places said, you know what, we're going to try to implement something, and we're going to model it off of the Rooney Rule. Senator Chuck Schumer very recently also cited the Rooney Rule when talking about congressional staff diversity and different types of tools that can be implemented in order to impact that diversity level. So I found this very interesting, and as a long sports fan, had known the Rooney Rule had been in place for quite a bit of time, and said, you know what, I wonder what the impact of the Rooney Rule really has been. So what is the Rooney Rule, first of all? Most of you guys here probably know. So in 2003, the National Football League instituted a rule. It's named after the Rooney family, Pittsburgh Steelers here. Here's draft day. They're drafting Terry Bradshaw, so they must be doing something, at least relatively right in the analytics realm at that time. But so the Rooney Rule was passed in 2003 and requires every NFL franchise, when there's a head coaching vacancy, to interview at least one minority candidate. Now, that's important. So that's what we call a soft affirmative action policy. And the goal of a soft affirmative action policy is to change the composition of the candidate pool rather than the criteria that are used to evaluate candidates. So once that person enters the interview process, they're held to the same criteria, they're held to the same standards, and the NFL oversees and tries to make sure that they have a fair and equitable process throughout this interview time. So I started to look in, well, what is the impact of the Rooney Rule? What's been the causal impact on the probability that a minority gets hired or the employment share in the NFL for minority head coaches? And one thing I found was a lot of articles, particularly in sports journalism, some of which said the Rooney Rule was working, some of which said the Rooney Rule wasn't working. But I didn't really find any causal evidence, articles that were using econometric criteria in order to look at and determine what the impact was. And I think this is very important given the number of firms that are implementing rules like the Rooney Rule and using sort of that style of affirmative action. So I decided, let's investigate what's the causal impact of the Rooney Rule on the probability that a minority head coach fills an NFL head coaching vacancy. And so I'll give you a real quick preview before we get into sort of the statistics of the matter. So what I use is called a difference in difference approach. It's an econometric technique that we're going to talk about a little bit more in depth. And just to give you a little bit of a preview, I find that a minority candidate is a statistically significant 19 to 21% more likely to fill an NFL head coaching vacancy in the post-Rooney era than the pre-Rooney era. So when we think about studying the Rooney Rule, I'm going to start really at the foundation, and then we're going to build up. So let's start just looking at some of the statistics. So what this graph has on the x-axis, we're just looking at year over time. My data set, I actually used data from 1992 to 2014 for a balanced panel. But if you also look from 1970 through 2014, the results don't change. The y-axis, we're looking at the NFL head coach minority share. So that's what percent of NFL franchises employ a minority head coach. And one of the things that's pretty striking is that prior, and I should tell you also as well that the vertical line denotes the passage of the Rooney Rule. So one of the things you'll notice right away is that prior to the passage of the Rooney Rule, the slope of the pre-trend is very flat. You know, a couple of years we might have some and then move around, but relatively flat. Once we hit the point at which the Rooney Rule's passed, we're seeing a large jump and then kind of another flattening off again. So this would suggest, just from looking at things, that perhaps the Rooney Rule really had a strong impact. As an economist looking at this, I'd say this is a good start. However, one of the things we're always concerned about is, were things changing, unobservable factors that we couldn't see, also happening at the same time that the Rooney Rule was being implemented? And if this is the case, which you can certainly think of some, maybe changes in racial sentiment, maybe other policy changes, maybe some of the changes of, prior past experiences of GMs that are kind of moving through the educational system, that are learning to value diversity more. Maybe these things are occurring at the same time, and the passage of the Rooney Rule just happens to occur at the same time. And what we're doing is picking up those effects and not the effects of an actual policy that's being passed. And so that's always the statistical challenge of trying to parse this out. And so what Difference and Differences does, which is the econometric strategy that I use, is we identify a comparison group that will hopefully be subject to those same factors that we're not observing, but not subject to the Rooney Rule. The NFL did us a huge favor in this case. The Rooney Rule is not applicable to NFL offensive and defensive coordinators. So we have a group that's being hired by the same individuals who are doing hiring for head coaches. However, where the head coaches are subject to the Rooney Rule, the offensive coordinators and defensive coordinators aren't. But they're also subject to any number of changing unobservables, such as changes in racial sentiment. And that should really be picked up in sort of their graphical evidence. And as you can see, that's certainly the case. With offensive and defensive coordinators, we're seeing an increase prior to the passage of the Rooney Rule. And then at the Rooney Rule, no jump or change that occurs coincident. And then maybe a slight decrease afterwards. Because quite frankly, offensive and defensive coordinators are really the group that is being pulled from for the most part. So we're pulling minorities out of that group and then hopefully trying to figure out ways to generate new minorities. But one of the challenges may be, NFL GMs are really doing hiring for both offensive and defensive coordinators and head coaches. What if they're actually applying the Rooney Rule to both, and it's just something that we're not necessarily quite picking up? So we decided, let's look at another comparison group. So this is, the blue line is the same line before, so NFL head coaches. And the green dotted line in this case is NC DoubleA head coaches in the automatic qualifying conferences. I apologize, that's already an outdated term. And independents. And so what you'll see is something even more akin to what is occurring in the pre-trend for the NFL head coaches. No jump that's happening at the point at which the Rooney Rule is passed, and then just a slight increase in the post-Rooney Rule era. So both of these things are suggesting, both of these comparison groups are suggesting that the Rooney Rule had an impact. And I think when you combine them, it's even more obvious, when we're looking at this graphically, in that the pre-trend is really picking up all of those things, that were unobservable that are impacting the hiring process over this time period. Changes in racial sentiment, changes in the composition of the candidate pool, and so forth, that's available to decision makers when making hiring decisions. And so we see a positive pre-trend, as we would expect. However, there's no jump that occurs at the Rooney Rule, which would certainly suggest that this deserves further investigation in sort of a statistical manner. And really, sort of the numbers tell us the same story. As you can see, the percent of vacancies filled by minorities when looking at NFL head coaches more than doubles. We're also seeing a positive increase for NFL offensive and defensive coordinators, as well as NCAA head coaches, would suggest that there's something that's going on underneath kind of that we can't see, but something that's happening that's encouraging people to hire more minorities at every level. However, we're seeing that jump occurs sort of just contemporaneously with the Rooney Rule only for the NFL head coaches. So what I'm going to do once again, sort of the data set that we're looking at includes NFL head coaches as well as both of those comparison groups, so NFL offensive and defensive coordinators as well as NC DoubleA head coaches. We're going to look at 1992 through 2014, but as I mentioned previously, if you use 1970 through 2014, it doesn't change the results. And so what I'm going to be looking at very specifically is what is the change in the probability that a minority fills an individual franchise vacancy. So to do that, I'm going to use ordinary least squares regression. For those of you who would like to see the model as in its equation form, it's there at the bottom. We've just talked through everything that model's doing as far as accounting for bias within the sample. In this table, each one of these columns represents a different OLS regression. Columns 1 and 2, we use NFL coordinators as a comparison group, whereas for columns 3 and 4, I'm using NC DoubleA head coaches. So Rooney times HC, the very first input in the table, is really the estimated impact on the probability of a minority being hired. And so what we can see here is that according to these models, depending on the specification, a minority head coach is 19.6 to 20.2% more likely to fill an NFL head coaching vacancy in the post-Rooney era than the pre-Rooney era. That's accounting for those unobserved characteristics that the comparison group is accounting for. It's also accounting for what you're seeing here with the year time HC. It's also accounting for the fact that the pre-trend might be slightly different for head coaches and the comparison group. And I'm also allowing that pre-trend in models 2 and 4 to not be linear. So what that just means is that we're allowing a comparison group to account for these things that we can't see that might impact and bias a Rooney Rule estimate, and we're allowing that specification to not necessarily be linear. We can certainly talk about any number of these things in the model specification afterwards, but as you can see here, I think the big takeaway is that regardless of comparison group, we have two very different things, right? NC DoubleA head coaches that are being hired by athletic directors from across the country. We have offensive and defensive coordinators, which are being hired by the same NFL GMs that are hiring head coaches. We are allowing the model to really not necessarily be linear and to take into account other characteristics. And we're coming up with very similar statistics that are statistically significant and that actually show not just a statistically significant impact, but a very practical impact. If we combine NFL coordinators and NCAA head coaches, so that was the last graph I showed you, we're once again seeing something very similar, so a 19.3 to a 19.6 increase in the probability that a minority candidate fills a head coaching vacancy in the post-Rooney era than the pre-Rooney era. And so what does this tell us? This tells us that the NFL is really sort of elevating the game in this area. The overall US workforce has become more diverse over time. However, the diversity is really not spilled over into the corporate boardroom. And one of the challenges, quite frankly, is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VII, outlaws the use of hard affirmative action policies. So those policies that I had mentioned before that really change the criteria by which candidates are being judged based on a certain demographic. And the Rooney Rule could really be an effective model of a soft affirmative action policy that could be implemented at the executive level. And a soft affirmative action policy, just once again, its goal is to change the composition of the candidate pool. However, further research is really needed to determine if policies such as the Rooney Rule would impact the hiring of minorities in executive leadership and other types of firms. So if anyone's here, from Facebook or Senator Schumer's office and would like to have an independent researcher look at that, more than happy to have that discussion. But it is something that we need to think about and moving forward and make sure that we really try to figure out what the causal impact of those things are. And I would say that really kind of in looking back at this research, that the NFL is really elevating the game by leveling the playing field. One of the first pieces of research was done by Madden and Ruther, which were involved in the original case and when the Rooney Rule was passed. And one of the things that Madden found was that prior to the passage of the Rooney Rule, if you were a minority head coach, you were required in terms of winning percentage to be far in the right tail of the distribution. You were an excellent coach. You won much more than anyone else did. However, they found that directly after the passage of the Rooney Rule, that moved down, that these individuals were still above the 50th percentile, but were no longer these outliers that occurred in the right tail of the distribution. So that would certainly suggest that the Rooney Rule is accounting for something that is occurring during the hiring process and is trying to figure out how to impact that. Now, in this case, unfortunately, given the data that I have, I can't really do a deep dive into what mechanisms might be. However, in this case, I just kind of pulled up 3 potential mechanisms, one of which, the second one, the public relations effect, we really account for that. Because the public relations effect, we would assume, would really be impacting the comparison groups, so NCAA head coaches, as well as NFL offensive and defensive coordinators in the same way that it would be impacting NFL head coaches. So we're accounting for that type of bias. However, we can't understand, just given this data, whether or not something like a mechanical effect, the fact that NFL head coaches are hired under a tight timeline, and that there's a lot of noise during the hiring process, namely that we don't know exactly what characteristics are going to denote a fantastic head coach, whether or not that's what the Rooney Rule is really addressing, or whether or not it might be some type of actual overcoming bias effect in which there is some reason that GMs or organizations or franchises aren't interviewing certain types of candidates based on demographics. And then once they enter the room and have entree into the playing field, that they're able to see what those people bring to the game. So I think moving forward, certainly the Rooney Rule has had a strong impact on the probability that a minority fills one of these vacancies. However, we need more research to determine whether or not that is going to stand up in other fields, and as well as trying to figure out furthermore what's really causing this type of discrimination and what kind of impediments is this type of rule overcoming. So with that, I'd be more than happy to answer questions and maybe leave a minute for the next group to get up here. It's been a challenge a bit. What's that? Have the NFL and the owners seen this work? So this has been published in the American Law and Economics Review, a peer-reviewed journal. So it's certainly out there in the public sphere for them to see. Whether or not individual franchises or owners have seen it, that I cannot tell you. I certainly hope that they have, though, and would enjoy engaging more people about it. Yeah, no, that's an exact question. I think my graphics make it a little bit unclear. So all of the figures I showed you are looking at employment share. So that's what percentages of franchises employ an African or a minority coach in this case. However, the dependent variable of the OLS regressions I was showing you is looking at individual hiring events. The reason I don't show you the graphics for the individual hiring events is because such a small number of hiring events occur in a given year that you're seeing a lot more movement, and it makes it a little bit easier to talk through sort of the differences and allow you to visually see that. But what those OLS regressions are talking about are individual hiring events. So in this case, a minority head coach is 19 to 21% more likely looking at all those individual hires. Yeah, that's an excellent question. In my research, just reviewing the Rooney Rule, I never saw. So this is actually very common in Supreme Court cases. So I also look at a lot of school desegregation and affirmative action cases, sort of in that realm. And courts will say we want to reach a ratio of 40 to 60, teacher. In regards to teacher employment, because that's very similar to students in the district or so forth. I never saw anything like that through the Rooney Rule. So I don't think that there was any sort of we need to reach this goal. One of the things that I will, I think is very important to talk about when we talk about sort of Facebook implementing this or Senator Schumer talking about implementing this is that, there need to be some enforcement mechanisms in place. And the NFL has been really good about that. I mean, some of the challenges, the biggest challenges with these types of soft affirmative action, firm-initiated policies are ensuring that the minority candidate has sort of a level playing field once they enter that process. And so the NFL and, of course, any number of journalists that are looking at the issue as well really keep an eye on whether or not this is occurring. Whereas if there's not any type of enforcement mechanism or oversight mechanism, that's a bit of a challenge. So to directly answer your question, I have not read any specific statistic that they're reaching for, although we're certainly seeing that they're expanding the rule. They've expanded it to women at the NFL executive head office, so recognizing that we need to allow women entree into the process as well at sort of the highest level. And there's been discussion about now whether or not to extend that to offensive and defensive coordinators. Because I can assure you that if I broke up the offensive and defensive coordinators, the racial composition of defensive coordinators and offensive coordinators is very, very different. And so recognizing that, kind of thinking now we've reached a certain level with head coaches, now kind of moving down the spectrum and allowing this process to work for other coaches as well is very important. Yeah, no, that's an excellent thought, and we certainly considered that when I was thinking about so offensive and defensive coordinators were sort of the obvious first step, and the more I started to think about this, we came into some of the same challenges, right? You're already pulling some offensive and defensive coordinators out because they're the most likely to be hired as head coaches, and then sort of what does replacement look like and so forth. I would argue that we certainly thought about some of the things you thought about when choosing NCAA head coaches from automatic qualifying conferences. Recently, there's been a number of NCAA head coaches that have made the transition over to the NFL, but if you look at the data historically, it's a very rare event. So a number of these people, very few people in this data set made the transition from NCAA head coach to NFL head coach. And if you look at the data historically, actually only one minority has ever made that transition. So it's not like we're really pulling a lot of minorities out of the NCAA coaching pool. And so that was really the decision as to why to look at NCAA head coaches. Also the fact that the hiring mechanism is so different. The individuals who are doing the hiring for NFL head coaches, GMs, I think have obviously the criteria for both is to win, but I think that they're, approaching that from very different perspectives and have very different backgrounds in doing that. So that was why we chose the NCAA coaches. One of the things that I learned when I was going through this is that the NFL was actually not the first one to implement this style of policy. I don't know if many of you know that the MLB has a rule as well, the C-League rule. However, and it goes back to just the thing that we were talking about in the previous question, is that the C-League rule is recommended. The league certainly doesn't do the same type of fact-checking and making sure and holding these teams accountable. So that was why another reason not to do Major League Baseball. And then we had some other reasons as far as the NBA is concerned. There's a lot more pull from past players and so forth. So that's sort of the reasoning.
Just gave one example in terms of measuring enforcement. Were there any other patterns that you kind of saw through research or your results of potential snags of applying this kind of strategy to a more corporate environment?
Yeah, I think the biggest ones would be enforcement. I think it's, number one, so the NFL's in a place where if they find, so there's only been once where they found that a team didn't follow the Rooney Rule. And that team was the Detroit Lions. They were fined $200,000. It was in the first year after the Rooney Rule's passed, and no other team has violated the rule since then. So I would certainly say that's one. There's sort of, this overarching organization that's looking and encouraging, and also we're getting a lot from, I think the sports writers do a really great job there because they're also watching that process and making sure that that's a fair process and talking to candidates once they leave. I think the second thing is ensuring that once that person enters in that they have a fair process. That the people who are actually doing the hiring are not using differential criteria, but also on the flip side of that, also giving a fair and legitimate hiring process, regardless of how you get accepted into the candidate pool. So I think that those are really the largest things. But I think one of the challenges is there's not really Facebook hasn't really talked about what their process has been like with implementing it, what some of the challenges have been, which I think would be very useful. But I think that those things go much more towards sort of like Chuck Schumer's situation when encouraging congressmen and women to implement this process. I mean, one of the challenges is congressional staff that you don't even have to report demographics. So how do we know that there's any type of fairness that's occurring during this process? Yeah, so actually in the very early stages right now, looking at, so this rule was extended to, looking at general managers as well. And so one of the things right now is looking to see whether or not this same impact occurs with general managers in an environment where we don't necessarily, it's not always kind of in the news cycle after, that hiring period. So we're not necessarily looking at it as much. It's not necessarily, as front and center as head coaches are. Are we still having the same effect for general managers? And if so, what can that tell us about some of the mechanisms that are actually at play? Any other questions? Well, excellent. Thank you guys very much. I really appreciate it.